So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Is that a knockoff? Julian Thorne sneered, fingering Elena Vance's collar in front of the dinner guests. The ballroom of the Vance Grand was a cathedral of glass and gold, the very building she had spent 3 years of her life designing down to the last brass rivet. Now, under the shimmering heat of 1,000 crystal prisms, her father stood before a circle of the city's elite, his voice carrying with the practiced projection of a man who had never been told to be quiet. He looked every bit the patriarch of a dying dynasty. His monogrammed velvet slippers were worn at the heels, and the scent of expensive, cloying tobacco clung to his vintage tuxedo like a shroud. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning her unbranded, charcoal-gray silk gown with visible disdain. "It's a bit drab for a Thorne event, don't you think?" he continued, his laugh a dry, rattling sound. "But then again, you always did have a penchant for the invisible. I suppose it's fitting for a glorified draftsman." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cold condensation of the sparkling water glass in her hand, the only thing grounding her as the familiar sting of his public dismissal radiated through the room. Beside Julian, her brother, Sebastian Thorne, smirked into his champagne. He was draped in a suit that screamed its price tag, his wrist heavy with a gold watch that Elena knew was paid for by the very trust fund he had drained. "Now, Julian," Sebastian said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Elena has to be frugal. It's not like she has the Thorne legacy to fall back on. She's far too busy playing architect in the suburbs." A few of the guests chuckled, the sound like breaking glass. Elena's gaze drifted to her mother, Victoria Thorne, who stood just a few feet away. Victoria didn't intervene. She simply adjusted her pearls and looked toward the orchestra, her silence a sharp, polished blade. "I'm here because I was invited, Julian," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against their turbulence. "By whom?" "The catering staff," Julian barked, turning back to his audience to ensure they caught the punchline. "Look at this place, the Vance Grand. It represents everything our family stands for: prestige, history, absolute power. You standing here in that, whatever that is, it's an eyesore on my property." The irony was a bitter weight in her chest. He called it his property, yet she knew the truth. She knew the Bentley he'd parked out front leaked oil because he couldn't afford the seals, and she knew the Thorne accounts were a hollowed-out shell of debt and desperation. Elena caught the eye of a woman standing near the marble pillars. Sarah Jenkins, her chief operating officer, gave a single, imperceptible nod. Sarah was dressed in a sharp, functional blazer, her presence the only piece of reality in a room full of ghosts. "Actually," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, "I think the architecture speaks for itself. It's built on a very solid foundation, unlike some things." Julian's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of stale brandy now overpowering the lilies in the foyer. "Don't you dare use that tone with me. You are a guest in this house by my grace alone. You've contributed nothing to this name but disappointment." He leaned closer, his voice a low hiss that only she and the immediate circle could hear. "Fetch me a fresh scotch, Elena. Since you're dressed like the help, you might as well act like it. It's the only way you'll be of any use tonight." Sebastian laughed again, a sharp, entitled sound that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck stand up. He reached out and flicked a stray thread from her shoulder. "Go on, sis. Make yourself useful. Father's thirsty." Elena looked at the two of them, the man who had stolen her credit and the brother who had stolen her childhood. She looked at Marcus Thorne, her uncle and the presiding judge of the circuit court, who was watching the exchange from the bar with a look of profound calculation. He knew. He was the only one who had seen the legal filings she'd spent months preparing. She didn't move toward the bar. Instead, she reached into her small, unbranded clutch and touched the edge of a heavy, embossed envelope. It was a cold, tactile reminder of the storm that was currently gathering in the dark. "I think I've stayed long enough," Elena said, her smile not reaching her eyes. It was a thin, strategic expression that Julian was too arrogant to recognize as a threat. "Good," Julian snapped, turning his back on her before she had even finished speaking. "The air already feels lighter. Try not to trip on your way out. I'd hate for you to scuff the floors. They're worth more than your life's work." Elena turned and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic military beat against the marble. She didn't look back at the laughter or the clinking of glasses. As she passed Sarah Jenkins, she didn't stop, but her words were clear. "Start the transfer, Sarah," Elena whispered. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed. "Once we trigger the default, there's no going back. They'll lose everything by Monday morning." Elena paused at the massive glass doors of the hotel she had built, the city lights reflecting in the panes like 1,000 tiny fires. She thought of the scotch Julian had demanded, the knockoff insult, and the years of being the invisible architect of their survival. "I'm not going back," Elena said. "I'm going forward. Let them enjoy the party. It's the last one they'll ever be able to afford." She stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the Thorne legacy behind her in the gilded tomb of the ballroom. She had 2 days. 2 days until the man who called her a guest realized he was standing in her living room. The next morning, the air inside the Thorne estate felt heavy with the scent of stale brandy and dying lilies. Julian Thorne sat at the mahogany breakfast table, his fingers tracing the gold rim of a coffee cup that had been in his family for 3 generations. He didn't look like a man whose empire was a hollow shell. He looked like a man waiting to be served. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the fraying threads of his monogrammed silk robe, a subtle decay he refused to acknowledge. "Where is she?" Julian asked, not looking up as Victoria Thorne entered the room. His voice was thin, sharpened by a hangover he was too proud to admit to. "Elena should have been here an hour ago to coordinate with the caterers for the weekend's polo brunch." Victoria smoothed her skirt, her eyes darting to the empty chair where their daughter usually sat, acting as the invisible glue for their chaotic lives. "She hasn't answered her phone, Julian. Sebastian said her room was empty this morning. Even her drafting table was cleared." Julian let out a sharp, dismissive bark of laughter. "She's sulking. That little display at the hotel was beneath her, but she'll crawl back. She has nowhere else to go. She's a Vance by blood, perhaps, but she's a Thorne by my grace." He reached for the morning paper, his movements slow and entitled. "Call her again. Tell her the bank sent a notice about a clerical discrepancy in the hotel's holding account. I need her to go down there and straighten it out. I have a lunch at the club and can't be bothered with paperwork." 10 miles away, the atmosphere was entirely different. Elena Vance stood in the silent, pressurized heart of a glass-walled office that overlooked the very hotel Julian thought he owned. The scent of fresh espresso and expensive toner hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the suffocating florals of her parents' house. She wasn't wearing the modest, muted colors Victoria always insisted upon. Today, she wore a charcoal suit of such fine, unbranded wool that it seemed to absorb the light. Sarah Jenkins walked in, her heels clicking a rhythmic military beat against the polished concrete floor. She held a tablet, her expression one of grim professional satisfaction. "The transfer hit the clearinghouse at 8:00 a.m. sharp," Sarah said, turning the screen toward Elena. "The Thorne Group's primary credit line has been frozen. Because you moved the underlying assets into the Vance Trust last night, their debt-to-equity ratio just went into a terminal nosedive." Elena looked at the red, flashing cursor on the screen. It represented the end of a 30-year lie. "And the default notice?" "Sent via courier 10 minutes ago," Sarah replied. "Julian will receive it before his first martini." Elena's phone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID read the Gables. She didn't pick it up. She simply watched the device dance across the glass surface, a frantic digital plea from a world that was already dead. She could almost hear Julian's voice, the demanding, condescending tone he used when he wanted her to fix the problems he created. "He thinks it's a clerical error," Elena said softly, her voice steady and cold. She reached out, her thumb hovering over the ignore button. "He thinks the world functions because he allows it to. He has no idea that the chair he's sitting in, the coffee he's drinking, and the roof over his head are all currently listed as collateral for a loan I just purchased." "What's the next move?" Sarah asked. Elena finally picked up the phone, but she didn't answer it. She powered it down, the screen turning black. We let the silence do the work. Julian Thorne has spent his whole life shouting over me. Now he's going to find out how loud it gets when I stop talking. She turned back to the window. Below, the city was moving, indifferent to the collapse of a dynasty. She felt a strange, sharp pang of loss, not for the family she was dismantling, but for the girl who had waited so long for them to love her more than her utility. That girl was gone. Sebastian is at the club, Sarah noted, checking a second device. He just tried to charge a vintage bottle of crystal to the company account. It was declined. Elena felt a ghost of a smile touch her lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of mathematical certainty. The countdown has started, Sarah. By Monday morning, they won't just be out of money, they'll be out of time. The phone on the desk began to ring again. This time it was the landline, the Thorne's lawyer. The panic was spreading. Elena didn't reach for it. She picked up her espresso, the warmth of the ceramic cup steadying her hands. The real work was just beginning, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't building a home for people who hated her. She was building a cage. 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside the Thorne estate felt as heavy and stagnant as the air in a tomb. The scent of Julian Thorne's expensive, hand-rolled cigars, a cloying mixture of cedar and fermented tobacco, clung to the velvet curtains of the study. He sat behind his mahogany desk, wearing monogrammed silk slippers and a velvet smoking jacket that had seen better decades. Outside the tall windows, his vintage Bentley sat on the white gravel driveway, a dark, iridescent pool of oil slowly spreading beneath its undercarriage like a black lung. Elena Vance stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She wore a charcoal cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, devoid of any visible logos or hardware. To the casual observer, she looked like a quiet assistant. To those who knew the cost of the fabric, she looked like the person who owned the room. "It's a clerical error, Elena," Julian snapped, his voice trembling with a cocktail of indignation and fear. He shoved a stack of red-stamped notices toward her. "The bank froze the primary trust. They're claiming there's an inconsistency in the collateral. I need you to call Marcus. He's a judge, for God's sake. One word from your uncle and this nonsense disappears." "Uncle Marcus is presiding over a federal circuit in D.C. this week," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady ribbon of ice. "And the bank isn't responding to social standing anymore, Julian. They're responding to the audit." Victoria Thorne looked up from her tea, her heavy gold bangles clattering against the fine bone china. "Don't be difficult, Elena. You've always had a head for these tedious numbers. Your father is stressed. Sebastian was humiliated at the club because of this glitch. Fix it so we can focus on the charity gala. The invitations have already been sent." The wait for it moment hummed in Elena's chest. She looked at her mother, the woman who had watched Julian drain Elena's college fund to pay for Sebastian's first failed venture, and said nothing. Victoria's only concern was the social calendar, even as the floorboards were rotting beneath her feet. "I've looked into the accounts," Elena said, stepping closer to the desk. She felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her pocket, the one Sarah Jenkins had delivered an hour ago. It contained the digital trail of every dollar Julian had borrowed from the employee pension fund of the very hotels Elena had built. "The inconsistency isn't a glitch, it's a hole, a very deep one." The door to the study swung open, and Sebastian Thorne marched in, his face flushed and his tie loosened. He smelled of expensive gin and desperation. He didn't look at Elena. He never did, unless he wanted something. "Dad, the dealership called," Sebastian barked, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "They're refusing to release the new Aston Martin until the wire clears. They actually suggested the Thorne name wasn't enough to guarantee the balance. Do you have any idea how that makes me look?" He finally turned his venom toward Elena. "Why are you just standing there? You're the architect, aren't you? Build us a bridge out of this. That's what we kept you around for." The rage spike was sharp, but Elena welcomed it. It was fuel. Sebastian spoke to her as if she were a piece of inherited furniture, a functional object meant to support his lifestyle. "I'm afraid I'm out of bridges, Sebastian," Elena said. She picked up a crystal paperweight from the desk, turning it over in her hand. The facets caught the dim light. Perhaps you could sell one of the watches I bought you last year. The Podex should cover the car. Sebastian let out a harsh, jagged laugh. That's not how this works. We don't sell things, Elena. We acquire them. You've clearly forgotten your place. Julian slammed his hand onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Enough. Elena, I am telling you to resolve this. Use the Vance Holdings reserve if you have to. It's all the same family pot, isn't it? Vance Holdings is a private entity, Julian, she replied, her eyes never leaving his. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, it has officially severed all management ties with Thorne Enterprises. I'm no longer your CFO. I'm just a guest in this house. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's mouth opened, then closed, his face transitioning from a bloated red to a sickly, papery gray. He looked at his wife, then his son, then back to the daughter he had spent 30 years overlooking. You can't do that, Julian whispered. The gala is in 3 days, the board, the investors. They expect to see a unified front. Then you should probably start practicing your speech, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. She set the paperweight back down with a soft, final thud. Because when the lights go up at that gala, everyone is going to see exactly what the Thorne legacy is built on. She turned to leave, her heels silent on the thick rug. She could hear Victoria's frantic whispering and Sebastian's rising temper, but she didn't stop. She had one more stop to make before the weekend. As she reached the foyer, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah Jenkins. The subpoenas for the pension records have been signed. Marcus is already asking questions. Elena stepped out into the cool evening air. The smell of the leaking Bentley followed her, a mechanical rot that no amount of Thorne prestige could cover up. She looked at the grand facade of the estate, the ivy-covered stone that looked so permanent, so invincible. 3 days, she murmured to herself, clicking her car remote. The countdown wasn't just for the gala anymore. It was for the moment the world realized that the architect hadn't just left the building. She was the one who had pulled the permit for its demolition. Across the city, the first of Julian's creditors was already dialing his number. The cage was locked. Now she just had to wait for the lights to go out. The day before the Thorne Foundation Gala, the air inside the Metropolitan Gallery felt like a tomb, cold, silent, and smelling of floor wax and expensive, dying lilies. Elena Vance stood in the center of the grand hall, her silhouette sharp against the white marble. She wasn't wearing the flashy labels the Thorne family favored. Her charcoal wool coat was unbranded, its value hidden in the perfection of its stitch. She looked less like a guest and more like the building's owner, which, as of 4 o'clock that afternoon, was technically true. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and the rhythmic, arrogant tap of leather soles echoed through the chamber. Julian Thorne marched in, his monogrammed silk scarf trailing behind him like a discarded banner. He didn't look at the art. He looked at the space as if it were a mirror reflecting his own fading glory. He stopped 5 feet from her, the faint, oily scent of his vintage Bentley clinging to his wool suit. "Still playing at being a designer, I see," he said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't wait for a greeting. He never did. "I hope you haven't cluttered the floor plan with your utilitarian sensibilities. This event is about heritage, Elena, something you've always struggled to grasp." She didn't turn to face him immediately. Instead, she ran a finger over the edge of a display plinth. The stone was cold, unyielding. "Heritage is only as strong as the ledger it's written on, Julian. I was just thinking how easily a facade crumbles when the weight becomes too much for the rot to support." He let out a sharp, dismissive bark of a laugh. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, the ones with the Thorne crest that Elena knew were currently being used as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan he couldn't repay. "You always were a poet of the mundane. It's a shame you couldn't channel that imagination into something useful, like maintaining the family's social standing instead of auditing it." He stepped closer, invading her space with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 60 years being told the world belonged to him. "Enjoy your little moment tomorrow. Wear something modest. Try to blend into the background. It's where you've always been most comfortable, after all. I'd be careful with that advice, she said, finally turning to meet his gaze. Her eyes were flat, devoid of the hurt he expected to see. When you spend too much time looking at the background, you tend to miss the floor dropping out from beneath your feet. If I were you, I'd take a very long look at the guest list tonight. There are names on there that might surprise you. Julian sneered, his lip curling in a way that highlighted the deep lines of stress he tried to hide with expensive skincare. Names? I invited the elite of this city. You think I'm intimidated by your little business associates? You're a junior partner in a firm that wouldn't exist without the Thorne name on the letterhead. Is that what you believe? A new voice cut through the tension. Marcus Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the north wing, his black robes replaced by a sharp suit, but his expression remained that of a judge. He looked between his brother and his niece, his brow furrowed. He had seen her confidence earlier that week, and the sight of her standing so calmly against Julian's vitriol seemed to unsettle him. "Marcus," Julian said, his tone shifting to a forced, jovial boom, "tell this girl that the Gala isn't the place for her cryptic warnings. She's acting as if she holds the keys to the city." Marcus didn't laugh. He looked at Elena, then at the digital tablet Sarah Jenkins held as she emerged from the side entrance. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply tapped the screen, and a soft chime signaled a successful file transfer. "The keys are irrelevant, Uncle Marcus," Elena said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Julian's bravado seem paper-thin. "It's the locks that matter." She checked her watch, a simple steel piece with a movement that cost more than Julian's car. "I have a final briefing. Enjoy the quiet while it lasts, Julian. Tomorrow the music starts, and I don't think you're going to like the tune." She walked past him without a second glance. The sound of her heels was a steady, rhythmic pulse against the marble. Behind her, she heard Julian start to bluster, his voice rising in an attempt to reclaim the room, but it sounded hollow, like wind whistling through a ruin. Back in her car, the silence was absolute. She pulled up the final countdown on her phone. 12 hours until the first subpoena hit the Thorne Foundation's front desk. 10 hours until the creditors' meeting. She looked out at the gallery one last time. The lights were flickering off, one by one, leaving the grand facade in darkness. The trap was set. The warning had been given and, as expected, ignored. Elena leaned back into the leather seat and closed her eyes. "Let the music play," she whispered. The following evening, the air inside the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of white lilies and the metallic tang of expensive champagne. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low hum of 500 voices, a sound that usually signaled triumph for the Thorne family. Elena Vance stood near the periphery, her back to a marble pillar, watching the spectacle. She wore a floor-length gown of charcoal silk, custom-tailored to her frame, but devoid of any visible branding or embellishment. To the untrained eye, she was a shadow in a room full of peacocks. To those who knew the cost of that specific weave of silk, she was the most expensive thing in the room. Julian Thorne stood at the center of the gilded floor, his laughter cutting through the orchestral music like a serrated blade. He was resplendent in a velvet tuxedo with his family crest embroidered in gold thread on the breast pocket, a loud, desperate display of a prestige that was currently hemorrhaging value. He gestured wildly with a crystal flute, splashing drops of vintage Bollinger onto the polished floor. He didn't notice the stain. He was too busy holding court, soaking in the adulation of a crowd that didn't yet realize they were attending a funeral. "You actually showed up," a voice sneered from behind her. Elena didn't need to turn to recognize the sharp, brittle tone of Victoria Thorne. Her mother approached, draped in diamonds that Elena knew had been used as collateral for a predatory loan 3 weeks ago. The older woman's eyes raked over Elena's understated dress with visible disdain. "I told you to wear the family sapphires, Elena. You look like a governess," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "People are asking why the daughter of the house is dressed for a boardroom rather than a gala. You're embarrassing Sebastian. He's trying to secure the merger tonight, and your aesthetic is projecting poverty. I'm comfortable, Mother, Elena replied, her voice a calm, steady anchor against Victoria's frantic energy. And I think you'll find that poverty is a matter of perspective. She watched as Sebastian Thorne joined them, his face already flushed from drink. He clapped a hand on Julian's shoulder, the two of them looking like a portrait of inherited arrogance. Sebastian leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and entitlement. Don't mind her, Mother, Sebastian chuckled, though his eyes were cold as he looked at Elena. She's always been the drab one. Julian, tell her what you told the board this morning. Tell her how we're going to handle the debt issue she was so worried about. Julian Thorne turned, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked at Elena as if she were a particularly dull child. It's simple, really. We've restructured. A few creative accounting maneuvers, a new line of credit from an offshore partner, and the Thorne Foundation is untouchable. You were so busy playing hotel manager that you forgot how real power works. We don't follow the rules, Elena. We write them. Elena felt the weight of the digital tablet in her clutch, the screen dark but the data within it live and lethal. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply let the silence stretch, a tactic that always made Julian uncomfortable. I hope the new partners are as reliable as you think, she said softly. Julian let out a bark of laughter, attracting the attention of several nearby guests. Reliable? They're desperate to be in business with a Thorne. Now be a dear and go find a waiter. I need another drink, and you're already dressed like the staff. A few people in their immediate circle chuckled. The insult was public, deliberate, and delivered with the casual cruelty Julian had perfected over decades. Elena saw Sarah Jenkins standing near the buffet, her eyes meeting Elena's for a fraction of a second. Sarah gave a single, microscopic nod. The creditors had arrived. They were currently being held in the foyer, waiting for the signal. Of course, Julian, Elena said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I'll make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve tonight. She walked away, the rhythmic click of her heels lost in the swell of the string quartet. As she moved through the crowd, she spotted Marcus Thorne standing near the dais. The judge looked grave, his hands folded behind his back as he watched his nephew's performance. He was the only one in the room who looked like he smelled the smoke before the fire. Elena paused beside him. It's time, Uncle Marcus. The judge looked at her, his expression a mix of sorrow and grim validation. Are you sure, Elena? Once the music stops, there's no restarting it. The music stopped years ago, she replied, her gaze fixed on Julian, who was now climbing the steps to the podium to deliver his keynote speech. They've just been dancing to the echo. She reached into her bag and tapped a single command on her phone. Across the room, Sarah Jenkins mirrored the movement. Julian reached the podium, tapping the microphone to get the room's attention. The lights dimmed, and the large projector screen behind him flickered to life, intended to show a montage of the Thorne Foundation's charitable works. Julian puffed out his chest, his hand gripping the lectern with the confidence of a king. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian began, his voice booming through the speakers. Tonight, we celebrate 50 years of Thorne excellence. We celebrate a legacy that cannot be broken, a fortune that cannot be diminished, and a name that stands above all others. Elena stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed. She watched as the first slide appeared on the screen. It wasn't a picture of a hospital or a school. It was a scanned copy of a foreclosure notice, dated that morning, with Julian's signature at the bottom. The room didn't go silent immediately. It took a few seconds for the guests to realize what they were looking at. Julian, still smiling, hadn't turned around yet. He was still soaking in the first few rows of confused faces, mistaking their shock for awe. I want to personally thank those who doubted us, Julian continued, his voice dripping with irony. Because tonight the truth comes out. Yes, Elena whispered to the empty space beside her. It really does. She watched as Julian finally turned his head to gesture toward the screen, the smug grin frozen on his face as he came face to face with his own ruin. The first subpoena server pushed through the double doors at the back of the hall, followed by 3 men in dark suits. The music didn't just stop, it died. The silence in the grand ballroom was a physical weight, heavier than the crystal chandeliers shimmering overhead. Julian Thorne remained frozen on the stage, his hand still half raised in a gesture of triumph that had turned into a grotesque statue of failure. Behind him, the projector hummed, a low, mechanical drone that filled the vacuum where the applause should have been. The foreclosure notice on the screen was undeniable, the red default stamp glowing like a brand against the white background. Elena Vance stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains. She didn't rush. Her footsteps were silent on the thick Persian rug, her tailored navy suit a sharp, understated contrast to the shimmering, over-the-top gowns of the women who had spent the evening whispering behind her back. She felt the cool, recycled air of the vents on her skin, smelling the faint, bitter scent of the lilies decorating every table, flowers for a funeral he didn't know he was attending. Julian Thorne's face didn't just change, it seemed to dissolve. The deep, performative tan he'd maintained for years turned a sickly, curdled gray under the stage lights. His left eyelid began a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't control, and his lower lip trembled with a sudden, wet slackness. The arrogance that usually held his features in a mask of superiority evaporated, leaving behind a map of desperate, aging lines. He looked less like a patriarch and more like a cornered animal realizing the trap had been set years ago. His breathing came in ragged, audible hitches that the microphone caught and amplified, broadcasting his panic to the entire ballroom. His eyes darted toward the exit, but the men in dark suits were already there, their presence as immovable as the debt he'd tried to hide. Marcus Thorne stood up from the front table, his face a mask of judicial disappointment. He adjusted his glasses, peering at the screen with the clinical precision of a man who had spent 40 years on the bench. "The signatures are verified, Julian," Marcus said, his voice carrying with a weight that silenced the few remaining murmurs. "This is a matter of public record now." Nearby, Victoria Thorne's hand shook so violently that her champagne flute slipped, shattering against the marble floor with a sharp, crystalline ring. She didn't even look down at the vintage liquid soaking into her silk hem. Her gaze was locked on her daughter, a mixture of horror and newfound, terrified respect. Sebastian Thorne, usually the first to jump to his father's defense, was already sliding his chair back, his eyes scanning the room for a way to distance himself from the wreckage. He wouldn't even meet his father's gaze. Elena walked to the edge of the stage, looking up at the man who had spent a lifetime telling her she was nothing. Sarah Jenkins stood at the base of the stairs, holding a leather-bound folder containing the final transfer of titles. She handed it to her employer with a sharp, professional nod. "This is a mistake," Julian stammered, his voice cracking. He reached for the podium, his knuckles white. "Elena, tell them this is some kind of sick joke. You're my daughter." "I was your architect, Julian," she replied, her voice calm, cutting through the room like a scalpel. "I built the foundation you stood on, and while you were busy selling the bricks to pay for your vanity, I was the one buying them back." She leaned in slightly, just enough for the microphone to catch her final words to him. "You said earlier that the truth comes out tonight. You were right. The Thorne name is a hollow shell, and I've just finished the demolition. I don't just hold the debt, Julian. I am the landlord, and you're trespassing." She turned her back on him before he could respond, handing the folder to Marcus Thorne for final validation. She didn't stay to watch the security team lead him toward the side exit. She didn't need to see the socialites turning their backs or hear the frantic phone calls to the press. As she walked toward the double doors, the heavy scent of lilies followed her, no longer a funeral scent, but the smell of a clean, sharp beginning. Behind her, the first of the Thorne legacy's creditors stepped forward, and the room erupted into a chaos she no longer had to manage. The silence that followed Elena Vance's declaration was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the static of 100 gasping breaths. For 3 seconds, the only sound in the Thorne ballroom was the low, rhythmic hum of the projector cooling fan. Then, the dam broke. Julian Thorne didn't just pale. His face seemed to physically erode under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. The arrogant mask he had worn for decades fractured, revealing a frantic, cornered animal beneath. His jaw hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that made his expensive dental veneers look like a row of jagged glass. A bead of cold sweat tracked a path through his foundation, carving a visible line down his cheek as his eyes darted from the screen to the faces of the board members, searching for a single ally. His skin took on a sickly, grayish hue, the color of wet ash, while his nostrils flared with every shallow, ragged breath. He reached for the mahogany podium to steady himself, but his fingers slipped against the polished wood, leaving a smeared trail of perspiration. "This is a fabrication," he finally shrieked, the sound thin and reedy, a far cry from his usual baritone command. He looked around the room, his eyes bloodshot. "Marcus, surely you see this. It's a digital hit job. She's manipulated the records. Elena has always been unstable, bitter." Marcus Thorne stepped forward from the shadow of a marble pillar, his expression as frozen as a winter lake. He didn't look at Julian with the usual familial warmth. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and stared at the documents displayed on the wall, the specific, undeniable signatures on the debt transfers. "I've spent 30 years on the bench, Julian," Marcus said, his voice echoing with the weight of a gavel. "I know your signature better than I know my own, and I know the seal of the High Court when I see it. These aren't fakes." The room erupted into a cacophony of hushed, jagged whispers. Sarah Jenkins stepped up beside Elena, holding a sleek carbon fiber tablet. She tapped the screen, and a new set of data replaced the bank statements. It was a live ticker of Thorne Enterprises credit defaults, cascading in real time. "As of 4 minutes ago," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a scalpel, "all Thorne corporate accounts have been frozen by the primary creditor. That creditor is Vance Holdings." Julian staggered back, his hip hitting the edge of the champagne table. A glass tipped over, the vintage liquid soaking into the white linen like a spreading wound. He looked toward his wife, his eyes pleading. Victoria Thorne stood perfectly still, her hand hovering near the diamond collar at her throat. She looked at the screen, then at the frantic, sweating man who had been her husband, and she took a deliberate step backward. The space between them grew by only 2 feet, but it felt like a canyon. "Julian," Victoria whispered, her voice devoid of affection. "Tell me the estate in Greenwich is safe. Tell me my jewelry isn't part of the collateral. Victoria, darling, listen." "Is it safe?" she snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden cold fire. When he didn't answer, she turned her head away, her profile turning to stone. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a word of defense. She simply signaled to her personal assistant to fetch her wrap. Sebastian Thorne, seeing the ship sinking, moved toward Elena with a practiced, charming smile that didn't quite reach his panicked eyes. He tried to place a hand on her shoulder, but she shifted just enough to make him grasp at empty air. "Elena, look, we're family," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "There's no need for this to be so public. We can go upstairs. We can talk about a restructuring. You've made your point. You're the big sister. We get it." Elena turned to him, her expression so vacant it was terrifying. "I stopped being your sister the day you watched Julian sign away my inheritance to pay for your gambling debts in Macau, Sebastian. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to collect." "You're a monster," Julian hissed, finding a spark of his old venom. He straightened his tie, though it was crooked and stained with sweat. "You'd destroy your own father's legacy just for a grudge. You'd put us on the street." "The legacy was dead the moment you valued your ego over the payroll," Elena replied. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried to the back of the hall. She felt the weight of the years falling away, replaced by a sharp, crystalline clarity. "And as for the street, I've already authorized the sheriff's department to oversee the transition. The locks on the Thorne offices are being changed as we speak. This house is next." The sound of heavy boots echoed from the foyer. 2 men in dark suits, carrying official folders, entered the ballroom. The socialites began to melt away, scurrying toward the exits to avoid being caught in the blast radius of the Thorne collapse. Julian looked around the emptying room, his empire dissolving into the scent of spilled wine and expensive perfume. He looked at Elena, his mouth opening as if to deliver one last insult, but no sound came out. He was a hollow man in a hollow house. Elena didn't wait for him to find his voice. She handed the final set of keys to Sarah and turned toward the double doors. She didn't look back at the ruin she had orchestrated. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy scent of lilies finally faded, replaced by the crisp, clean smell of the coming rain. Behind her, the lights of the Thorne estate flickered once, then dimmed, as the first of the power cuts began. She walked toward her car, her footsteps steady on the gravel, finally at peace with the silence. 6 months had passed since the iron gates of the Thorne estate were padlocked by federal marshals, yet the silence that followed was the loudest thing Elena Vance had ever heard. She stood in her new corner office, a space defined by floor-to-ceiling glass and the absence of clutter. There were no gilded frames here, no heavy velvet curtains smelling of dust and stagnant tradition. The air smelled of ozone from the morning's rain and the faint, clean scent of the white tea steaming on her desk. She adjusted the cuff of her charcoal blazer. It was a bespoke piece, devoid of any visible logo, fitting her shoulders with a precision that felt like armor. She didn't need a monogram to tell the world who she was anymore. The world already knew. A soft chime echoed through the room. Sarah Jenkins stepped inside, carrying a tablet and a thin manila folder. She looked energized, her movements crisp. "The final liquidation of the Thorne holdings was finalized this morning," she said, her voice steady. "The creditors took the house, the cars, and the remaining offshore accounts Julian Thorne tried to hide." Elena took the folder, her fingers grazing the smooth paper. "And the family. Sebastian Thorne is currently working as a junior consultant for a firm in the city, though I hear he's struggling with the concept of a 40-hour work week," Sarah replied, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "He's living in a studio apartment. No doorman, no valet, just a commute and a cubicle." Elena opened the folder. Inside was a photograph taken by a private investigator, a standard procedure to ensure the restraining orders remained unviolated. It showed Julian Thorne standing at a bus stop. His coat was a vintage cashmere piece that had clearly seen better days, the hem frayed and the color faded by the sun. He was staring at his reflection in the plexiglass of the shelter, his face a roadmap of bitterness and bewilderment. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life expecting the floor to be made of marble, only to find himself standing on shifting sand. "He still hasn't reached out?" Elena asked, her gaze fixed on the man who had once tried to erase her. "He can't," Sarah reminded her. "The legal wall we built is ironclad. He spent his last few $1,000s trying to hire lawyers to contest the takeover, but no one will touch him. His reputation was the only currency he had left, and you spent it all in that ballroom." Elena closed the folder. She felt a flicker of the old rage, the phantom pain of years spent being the invisible daughter, the scapegoat for a dynasty's failures. But the heat was gone, replaced by a cool, functional clarity. She had won, but the victory had a sharp edge. Later that afternoon, Elena found herself at a small, quiet cafe near the park. She had arranged to meet Victoria Thorne, a meeting she had nearly canceled 3 times. Her mother was already there, seated at a corner table. The woman who had once commanded every room with a flick of her diamonds now looked startlingly small. She wore a simple navy coat and no jewelry other than her wedding band, which hung loose on a finger thinned by stress. "Elena," Victoria said, her voice trembling as she reached across the table. Elena didn't take her hand. She sat down, keeping her movements measured. "You asked to see me, Mother." "I just wanted to know if you're happy," Victoria whispered, her eyes searching Elena's face for a glimmer of the girl who used to beg for her approval. "Julian is. He's not well, Elena. He talks to the walls. He blames Marcus Thorne for the legal rulings, blames the bank, blames everyone but himself. We have nothing left." "You have exactly what you earned," Elena said, her voice like a sheet of ice. "You watched him steal my inheritance." You watched him belittle me for a decade while Sebastian spent the money I was making for the firm. You chose the status of being a thorn over being a mother. Now you have the status of a thorn. It just happens to be worth nothing." Victoria flinched as if she'd been struck. "We're still family." "Family is a verb, not a noun," Elena replied. She stood up, leaving her tea untouched. "I've settled a modest annuity for you. It will cover a small apartment and your basic needs, provided you don't try to live like a queen. It's more than Julian ever gave me." She walked out of the cafe before the tears could start, stepping into the cool afternoon air. She felt the weight of the silence again. She had dismantled the Thorne empire brick by brick, and in doing so, she had dismantled her own history. She was a woman with $1 billion company and a name that carried weight in every boardroom in the country. But she was also a woman who had no one to call for Sunday dinner. As she reached her car, she saw a flash of movement across the street. Julian was there, standing near a trash can, clutching a tattered briefcase. He saw her. For a second, the old arrogance flared in his eyes, his mouth opening as if to shout a command or an insult. Elena didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze, her expression unreadable, and watched as the fire in his eyes died out, replaced by the hollow realization that he no longer existed in her world. She stepped into the backseat of her car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud that shut out the noise of the street. The car pulled away, leaving the ghost of the Thorne legacy behind in the rearview mirror. Elena looked ahead at the unfolding road, finally at peace with the cost of her own freedom.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.